Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. If you're on the East Coast, this morning, if you're on the West Coast, we're really excited for the conversation today, which will be about Russia's AI disconnect, the war in Ukraine, and how that has impacted the Russian AI sector. I am thrilled to be joined by two fantastic experts today. We have Dr. Rita Konaev, who is the Deputy Director of Analysis and a Research Fellow at CSET, and we have Sam Bendett, who's an advisor in the Russia Studies program at CNA. They're also both part of the CNAS Technology and National Security program. My name is Leah Walker. I'm a Senior Defense Associate at the Institute for Security and Technology. We are a Bay Area-based defense technology research institute, and we work at the intersection of wicked problems that are ever upcoming in this increasingly technologically and perhaps geopolitically less stable world. Really excited to have this conversation. Sam, Rita, thank you so much for joining me. I want to say quickly for the audience that if you have any questions for the experts or any questions that you would like put into the conversation, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. We will be referring to those questions throughout the conversation. So we look forward to your injects. Sam, Rita, again, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. I want to start off I thought it would be good to start off with your preliminary thoughts of, as this conflict unfolded, what were you watching for in the Russia AI space? I know that's a bit of a broad question, but I think it can open us up into an interesting discussion.
Well, one of the things we probably were watching for is Russian admission that artificial intelligence would be utilized in a decision-making capacity, in data imagery analysis, in computational and assisting capacity to commanders at the tactical and the strategic levels. This is what the Russian military discussed earlier as far as using artificial intelligence as a tool for the war maker, both at the higher levels and at the tactical levels. Probably one other aspect is the admission by the Russian military that they may have been developing artificial intelligence, again, as a data analysis tool, as a decision-making tool for a range of weapons and systems, such as artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, radar, electronic warfare, and a range of others, including unmanned aerial vehicles. But most of that was probably in different stages of testing and evaluation. And so it was difficult to predict which of those systems would be mature enough to be used in a conflict like Ukraine.
Sam, I think that's such an important point, and one that we have to take in a very close consideration, not only to better understand our assumptions in this conflict as it evolves and develops, but also our understanding of our own capabilities as, as the United States and its military and its defense apparatus, as well as assessments of our adversaries and other competitors, including China. A really fundamentally important point to understand about current AI technologies and current AI capabilities, for the most part, are in the development phase. Specifically the capabilities that are intended for the battlefield. A recent study by the Government Accountability Organization here in the US that analyzed where are the US AI military efforts are, in the cycle of development, has clearly stated that right now, any sort of AI technologies and the AI capabilities that are intended for the battlefield are very much in the research and development phases, and some of them are in the experimentation phase. There are certain almost very, very few systems that have been deployed in operational conditions. And this is the US military that is, we all know, is much more advanced on military AI development as well as civilian AI development than Russia. We have been tracking, both Sam and I, Sam for longer, the capabilities that the Russian military has been discussing and analyzing and examining and considering And we've also been tracking what the industry has been claiming to have in terms of what it is selling, which is an important point when profit is concerned. But I think we are in a moment where we need to have a sober conversation, differentiating what is in development, what is in conceptualization, even several steps even before development, and what is battle ready, deployment ready, let alone useful on the modern battlefield.
I think that's
And this is the,
really
right.
important.
This is a very important point because Russian military writing has been fairly detailed, fairly open. There's been a lot of discussions of what AI would mean for the Russian military, but mostly this was a very forward-looking approach. At some point in the future, AI would do X, Y, and Z for the Russian military, and that discussion would be sort of connected to the Russian military needs today on the battlefield. What we have witnessed, however, with the first opening weeks of the Ukrainian campaign, and certainly 2 months into it, is that the actual military campaign would be very different and could be very different from any potential high-tech plans that the Russian military was and is planning. And this is probably not just unique to the Russian military, but other militaries as well, who are also thinking through what the development of AI and military robotics would mean for their military.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Sam, you and I have had this conversation in the past about how optimistic the Russian military can be about their projections. I think that's a really important distinction, what is really being developed versus what is being applied. I guess my question then to the two of you is, what did we actually see applied in this war in terms of military technologies that used some sort of artificial intelligence? Were there any that we saw actually used in conflict?
We have seen Ukrainians actually make very good use of that. They've used commercial Clearview AI to help identify Russian soldiers, both serving and those killed in action. Again, we haven't had any specific admission from the Russian military that they were using any type of AI in this particular war, either at the front or at the back end as a decision-making or an analytical tool. I think something to keep in mind is just because Russia isn't talking about it doesn't mean it's not doing it. But at the same time, when it comes to this type of military technology, it is actually the commercial aspects of both AI and robotics that have literally seized the headlines and became more hands-on in all manner of speaking for both sides, including Ukrainians using AI and both Ukrainian and Russian military using, for example, commercial drones for better surveillance and reconnaissance.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the only place where I've seen anything approximating AI in the public view is disinformation operation that was exposed by Facebook, I believe, and they employed some sort of AI generated, AI manipulated profiles and pictures, which is quite, at this point is not a very sophisticated capability and something that we've already seen used previously. I think another area to be, aware or at least tracking is that as we're increasingly hearing more about Russian cyber attacks, especially attacks to gather and accumulate data on the people that live in Russian occupied areas, we should be tracking closely what are the tools that they're going to be employing to mine that data and analyze that data and then potentially use it for surveillance purposes, for repression purposes, filtration purposes, and all the, the illegal and frankly terrible things that they have demonstrated to do in areas that fall under their control. So that's something to watch for. The other thing is that if we are talking about cyber operations and cyber attacks, that's an area where seeing the role of AI is going to be very difficult to discern from the outside. There's which is, as part of the broader conversation, how can we observe AI being employed on the battlefield? In many ways, we can't really know. And the differentiations and distinctions between what is autonomous, what is unmanned, to the public view have really not been made that sufficiently clear. So cyber is one area where it is even harder to decipher and discern whether AI is being employed to, kind of accelerate the offensive capability, the offensive attacks, or, to garner and analyze some of the data that is acquired by those means.
And I would add to Rita's excellent points. There's no lack of discussion even now. There are items in the news, there are items in military magazines talking about what AI would mean for the Russian military. And the conversation is basically ongoing in the same way since 2018, 2019, 2020. And now in 2022, there's a similar discussion on the importance of artificial intelligence for the Russian military. And so we kind of have to recognize the gap between the theory and conceptualization and the actual implementation, which is very, very difficult, especially in a mass scale conflict like Ukraine.
No, absolutely. And I want to take a little bit of time and go back to sort of where we were in 2019 and 2020 and 2021, particularly with an eye towards the Russian AI commercial sector. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you saw the state of the Russian AI commercial sector before the war, what challenges it faced, how you perceived its growth, how you perceived its sophistication, how investment was in the sector, and I think really interestingly, how much of that growth and sophistication was dependent on international collaboration or investment.
Go ahead, Sam. You guys had that massive study.
Yes.
Well, I think if we just take a general look at the state of the civilian AI development, we can objectively say that all indicators were trending up. Government was getting more active. There was a lot of investment happening. There were attempts at diversifying investment into the private sector. There was a lot of back and forth between the private sector developers, the academia, the government, and even the military. Obviously, issues like workforce development was at the top of everyone's agenda, and the Russian government and all major AI-related institutions recognized that training a better workforce, better capable, better educated workforce is very important. So there were attempts to launch programs at universities dealing with AI and machine learning development. On the whole, again, the indicators were trending up, but there are also signs of trouble because the government and the institutions were recognizing that Russia doesn't have enough highly educated people. It doesn't have enough freedom of investment and freedom of development the way that it exists in the United States or Western Europe or other parts of the world that are also heavily investing in artificial intelligence. But there were also attempts to build bridges between the civilian and military developers. There were open discussions. There was international cooperation, and that's very important. Going back to 2018, the state of the Russian AI development was dependent on its being part of the larger global research and development. And that included both software and hardware, international cooperation, participation in conferences. When that stopped abruptly on February 24th, a lot of these deficiencies were exposed. And I'll let Rita kind of take off from here.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I think trending up is largely correct, with the caveat that the baseline is not very high. Because, and like Sam and I have talked a lot before and have been pretty explicit, Russia has lagged and will continue to lag behind the United States and China in terms of investment, in terms of hardware capabilities, software development capabilities, any prospects of AI integration, and even the digital economy more so as the foundation there. There are other, continuing on the signs of trouble conversation, one of the challenges remains that it is very much a government-led process with I don't know how to call them, semi-independent industry or heavily influenced, heavily controlled, largely directed industry players that were sustainable with, maybe perhaps even some sort of a promising future if things worked out differently, contingent on pretty closer relationships with external, international actors. Another sign of hope, I would say, was some of the reforms that were being implemented to raise the status of Russian universities. And we have seen some progress in that area. Still, again, not breaking it into the top 100, but making progress, starting some, AI programs, the majors and masters and even PhD programs, and supporting students that were pursuing that, and kind of increasing exposure and funding for those types of initiatives. I think that's an area that is going to suffer immensely, just because perceptions and prospects for the future right now probably are not looking particularly inspiring. Again, with AI and just technology development in general being such an internationalized, open, globalized field that is really important to have open borders for. But at the same time, and I'm sure we'll touch on this at some point in the conversation, I also don't want us to fall into this trap where we only see things from the perspective of the West. Mm-hmm. The West might be right now, at the most hopeful scenario, at a hiatus from relationships with Russia. But that is not the entirety of the world by any means. And I'm not just talking about the obvious, role that China will increasingly play in this space, but relationship with India remain unresolved. And it's not decided that that relationship is going to go fundamentally south. Countries throughout Southeast Asia have divergent opinions about the future of Russia than the United States and its Western allies. Countries in the Gulf could be potential partners. Israel still remains in a pretty complicated relationship about the future of collaboration with Russia. So we gotta be quite careful in what we are assuming is going to restrict the future of Russian technology development, not only from a domestic perspective, what's going to happen to Russian domestic talent and industry and commercial spaces, but also how the world is going to continue reacting to Russia. And it is by no means is doing so in a as unified of a way as the West has. And the West is not the entirety of the world.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point. And as you said, it's not just China. I think I'm personally going to be watching very carefully what happens with India, because they do have an established defense trade with Russia. They are used to exchanging military equipment and having close defense conversations. So I think that'll be really interesting. Before we get into sort of the interactions between the government and the commercial sector in Russia, I do want to go back to talent, which is something that both of you brought up. And CSET has done some great work on how important talent is to having a successful AI industry. I wonder if either of you have a sense of how much of that talent was domestic and how much of that talent was dependent on non-Russian education. if that's even something we know.
It's probably a safe bet that the majority of that education was done, excuse me, in country. I think it's important to recognize the role of the state in Russia, as Rita has indicated. Most of the key investments in high tech are actually done by the state. All of Russia's best universities have the word state or federal in the title. Russia's state corporations are a big source of revenue for the country, and many Russian students who graduate end up working at many of these state institutions. So the state role is basically throughout the entire research and development cycle of practically any and every high-tech product, with a few very notable exceptions. And so plenty of Russian universities were able to churn out a lot of graduates in, for example, STEM degrees, but not necessarily AI specifically, or something that relates to machine learning or Internet of Things or quantum. Those were very few and far in between, and the government was making an effort to increase the graduation rate and invest in these programs. But at the same time, there was also open cooperation for many of the most talented and probably luckier graduates, those who probably settled in big cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg, that were able to work for the foreign companies, that were able to get education either in person or online. But on the whole, I think if we look at the entire ratio of graduates, most were educated in Russia. And there was expectation going forward before the war that the government will be investing even more in growing this future workforce, investing in AI and STEM programs, not just at the university level, but also high school, middle, and even kindergarten level as well, through different programs across the country that teach children and teenagers about computing, IT, and even robotics.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, I mean, Sam is absolutely on point here. The conversation about talent and where they are educated and trained, I think for Russia is largely domestic, but it's also a really interesting point to understand in terms of talent retention when it comes to people who go and are then educated abroad. So as you mentioned, we've done a good amount of research on AI talent, and one of our earliest and most impactful reports by my colleague Remkus Westlund, who is now at CSIS, has focused on tracking the intention to stay and stay rates of PhD graduates in AI-related fields. So I believe it's computer science and perhaps electrical engineering. And what they found, and first of all, what one of the key findings was that the majority of PhD graduate students in the US in those fields are foreign. It's interesting because you see at the BA and MA level, it skews about 70% US, American, and about 30% foreign. But when you get to the PhD level, it flips. And we're talking about 70% of the PhD level students being foreign. But when you track what are their kind of career trajectories post-PhD and where do they go, you find that the absolute majority of them stay.
Yes.
So that's the interesting point about foreign educated talent. I mean, not in AI by any means, but I'll throw myself in that pool because I came here for college and here I am. But they tend to stay. And the majority of that pool of that analysis was, Chinese students and some Indian students. Those were the two biggest groups. But I would assume it would equally be true for the Russian students that have come here to study for, any sort of STEM or AI related degrees or have gone to Europe. I would assume that those students already tend to stay. And if they do return, it's probably for very, very competitive roles, aside from, any sort of personal considerations. So the talent that was the backbone of Russia's AI future, let's call it like that, is most likely domestically educated. And we can talk about where they might be going or what are their optionalities going forward. But I think it's important to understand the domestic nature of that talent and workforce.
Thank you.
And one more thing to add for just a second. In fact, opening up Russia to foreign students and foreign researchers was one of the main points in the Russian AI national strategy, and then the federal project, which grew out of it. Russia was supposed to create competitive salaries, competitive environment, probably in the largest cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and a handful of others. But they were kind of trying to get to the point where foreign researchers would consider studying, researching, working on AI in Russia in its largest cities. And again, this was kind of codified at the highest levels. And of course, the war and the subsequent conditions and whatever happened after that really kind of kicked the bench away from from this initiative. It's very difficult to imagine today whether many AI researchers would consider Russia in its current state as their AI study or research destination, at least at this point in time.
Certainly. That is a very helpful baseline for us to move this discussion forward on. I think it's really important to understand all that context that we've just laid out. Moving forward, could you both say a few words about and you've spoken to it a little bit, but just sort of putting it out there, the connection between the Russian commercial sector and the Russian military, and how that has sort of evolved in the lead up and during the war. Sam, I'll start with you.
Sure. There are two ways of looking at it. One is that a lot of Russian AI and robotics development was taking place in a relatively siloed environment because it was classified and there were few, if any, connections. On the other hand, there was a recognition within the Russian military that the commercial sector, and especially few but rapidly growing private sector companies, were actually moving along quite well. And so there were calls for greater cooperation between the military and the civilian sector. We actually saw that in print and on video during Russia's Army annual military expos, where there was always a roundtable on the importance of AI and robotics for the military. And then there were also projects which had sort of an open architecture, a military project where civilians were invited to participate, to demonstrate their technologies, and to see whether they would be able to mesh with the military. And I'm referring to projects within the Advanced Research Foundation, or Russia's equivalent of DARPA-like institution, and one that I cite all the time because it's been in the news and actually still is in the news, and that's the Marker unmanned ground vehicle, which had a Lego-like open architecture where civilian developers were able to test their sensor packages, their other systems on that military vehicle, and then take that ready solution back to the commercial sector, or maybe house it back within the military. There were probably other projects like that. So there was some research which was absolutely independent of the civilian research and development, and there was research that actually depended on civilian research and development, and probably many projects in between.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. It's not a very clearly delineated space, because you have essentially the state-owned enterprises that are fundamentally responsible for development of defense technology. And those are the ones that are leading the primary push behind robotics and any sort of other advanced, sophisticated military technology. But in an area like AI, where the majority of the innovation has generally been driven by the commercial sector, if you hope to have the next level, the next generation of capabilities, it will be hard to proceed without commercial technology and commercial involvement, which is why you did see that push that Sam was describing to create more synergies or linkages. The success of that is hard to judge. The prospects for success going forward are actually, I don't think we should rush to judgment about the inclination of the Russian civilian technology sector to work with the military, however it is going to be impacted by the sanctions when they fully come to bear. Because in a war, even an illegal, unjustified criminal war like this one, there is an inevitable rally around the flag effect that happens in societies. And while we are, a lot of us are expecting a blowback from the Russian society, or resistance, or, dissatisfaction, especially if there are severe economic impacts or exposure to the truth of what's happening on the ground, I think we should also be open to the possibility of the opposite. And the rally around the flag is a real effect that happens in countries when they are at war, even when they are at a war of choice, and at a war that is absolutely horrific and unjustified. So we shouldn't immediately assume that civilian developers, entrepreneurs, and technologists are going to be suddenly completely disinclined from working with the Russian military because it's involved in Ukraine. We should, I think one of the main larger big picture takeaway from this, from the past 2 months, is that we should fundamentally challenge and question our own assumptions. And this is one of them, that we shouldn't just assume that there's going to be a massive blowback, that we could, have the potential, at least in our head, that maybe there might be cooperation as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that we should all keep in mind as this unfolds, is as much as the sanctions may be debilitating and as much as they may seem really quite serious, there's a rich history of military innovation being spurred by denial. I mean,
Yep.
We can think of treaty battleships if we go back to the early 20th, but being restricted from certain things might just provoke innovation to get around that, leading to new or better capabilities. So that's one thing I'll be watching for. And it's something that I think is very interesting when mapping technological innovation vis-a-vis sanctions regimes. Thank you for that. That is, yeah, but thank you for that summary. That's really helpful for getting a sense of where we're at. I want to get into sanctions. First, I want to remind everyone that you are free to use the Q&A function, and I will feed those questions to the participants. You brought up sanctions, Rita. I think that's top of mind for a lot of people here and thinking about the Russian tech sector. What sanctions are posing the most risk to the Russian AI sector? And which ones would you say might be the most effective and sort of causing pain?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to note is that we can't know right now. It's too early to tell. We have declarations. We don't really know about the scope of implementation at this point. I'm not a sanction expert by any means, but even if they were all already implemented, which they're not, it still takes time for measures like sanctions to have a real significant impact. Sometimes it can be months and even years, especially in a country like Russia, which has spent the last 5 to 8 to much longer, even years, working to actively insulate itself to the effects of sanctions. I'm not saying it has done a great job in doing so, and especially in the technology sector, which is very globalized and interconnected, and the supply chains are so integrated and complex that it's inevitably going to be affected by it. But A, that effect will not necessarily be immediate. B, it might not be as decapitating and destructive as we might initially, expect. So the point is remains to be seen. But in terms of what type, I think the ones that are targeting specific major companies are going to be important. Any sort of company, targeting the companies producing microchips, the ones that are developing hardware, the ones that are working on software, those are going to be hard. The fact that Yandex is really taking a hit and is losing its international investors and relationships is going to be significant because it's one of the bigger innovation hubs for AI in Russia. What else? The fact that from what I've been noticing, they're also, at least in the US, are paying attention to how certain entities might try to get around sanctions. For example, by setting up subsidiaries or conducting deals under different types of names. The fact that they're, not letting that happen or run rampant is important to watch. The other thing is, and I'm not exactly sure how this is going to manifest itself, but what are going to be the relationships between companies that want to continue hiring Russian nationals from, to work virtually? What are the limitations on them? And what are those limitations going forward? The amount of work those people are going to be able to do on Russian networks using Russian cloud technology, using Russian equivalent of Microsoft Word might not be the fastest, most sophisticated, but even that might adjust and change with time. So these are definitely developments to watch, and I think we shouldn't really immediately rush to conclusions about the debilitating scope of these questions. We got to see how the Russian system and specifically the technology ecosystem adjusts, how resilient it is in the coming months.
No, absolutely. And I think the foreign companies with workers in Russia is a really interesting point. I had some conversations with some management level people at some of the bigger tech companies in the Bay Area as this was going, and they were having a bit of a freak out about the situation in general, but they were also saying, we have employees in Russia. Not only are we concerned about potential cybersecurity consequences, but we're really concerned about what's going to happen to our employees just for being affiliated with us. And suddenly there were all these conversations happening in those circles of, is it just too much of a risk to have employees in these countries who could then be targeted by the state if our company gets in trouble for certain actions it may take in country? So I think that's all really interesting. Sam, do you have anything to add on sanctions?
Yeah, actually. So we're seeing kind of the following chain reaction. So the government is saying that they're going to push wholesale import substitution and wholesale development of software and hardware products, especially those that are related to AI, quantum development, Internet of Things, and big data and cloud computing. Russian companies, Russian organizations working on that are going to be prioritized. There's going to be plenty of funding available for these companies and plenty of state-run investments into these companies. If you are a software programmer who develops Russian software or can migrate a company's sort of software / hardware from a Western to Russian equivalents, then you got it made right now. These are some of the most sought after IT positions in the country. And so with plenty of funding, kind of plenty of money thrown at the problem, the question is it all going to stick? Is it actually going to work? Yes, the Russian government is saying that they no longer want to be caught in this trap where they are wholesale dependent on Western technologies for some of the critical applications and some of the critical developments. But all of that takes years. It takes years to develop a product. It takes years to develop a solution. It takes years to implement that. And so what we're going to see right now is a very kind of Russian mergers and acquisitions, where government is pushing for cooperation and integration between state-run companies, which are some of the biggest customers of software and hardware, the developers, as well as the research institutions, which are sometimes housed at Russian universities or within those state companies itself. So the biggest winners of this integration, of this merger and acquisition, are probably going to be state-run companies like Rostec and many others. At the same time, the government wants to sound confident about the investment climate in the country. And it is telling Russian investors who can no longer invest in Western or global assets and stocks because they're impeded because of sanctions, that they should be investing in Russian long-term projects related to AI, quantum, big data, and others that run on domestic software and hardware, creating a long-term chain from the investment to the product that now is completely supported and underwritten by the domestic software and hardware development. And again, the government keeps talking about key investments in AI, in quantum and machine learning, but now the government wants to make sure that all of that is done based on Russian talent, Russian products, and Russian services. Again, if there was no war and Russia just decided to do this completely, it would take them anywhere from 3 to probably 8 years to do that. The fact that they have to do it now under sanctions conditions puts a lot of these plans into question, but the government wants to sound confident. And if you look at the semantic analysis of Russian statements, Russian government statements, that they are exuding confidence. While recognizing a problem, they're now saying it is time to finally invest in Russian solutions that are going to be independent of, or at least partially independent of, the global supply chains and the dependence on Western technologies, even if those Western technologies are better.
I think that is fascinating, and I sincerely hope that in the next 5 years, Sam, you write reports about how that strategy goes.
We can write that sooner than that, probably.
Fantastic. Look forward to reading it. We do have a question from the Q&A. So again, a reminder, please submit any questions you may have. But the question is, can the US or the EU and other countries involved in the current sanction regime do anything to further increase Russian brain drain?
That's a really big question. It's a very important question. It is a question that is discussed at the highest government levels. Prime Minister Mishustin recently spoke at the Russian parliament saying that he doesn't believe that all IT workers would leave Russia, and that the government and the companies and the enterprises must make sure to create conditions for the Russian IT workers to stay. His deputy Chernyshenko said that not all IT workers are going to leave. I think we're up to 200,000 people out of a relatively small talent pool. And so government is fully aware of the problem, but it wants to make sure, so there's a balance here. The government doesn't believe that it should shut the door to immigration of IT workers if those people want to do that. Because there was a plan at the Duma, which was proposed by Mr. Prigozhin of the Wagner fame, who wanted to implement a Soviet-style law that basically prohibited immigration for certain professions, including IT, effectively trapping people in the country so they must work only on domestic enterprises. And so on one hand, the government, Russian government, is still open to the idea that people can immigrate if they so choose. On the other hand, if there's going to be very concerted push by the West and the global community to literally get the Russian talent to leave wholesale, then Russian government may, in panic, basically close the doors to that immigration. So it's a very interesting balance.
Rita, what can those Western countries do to sort of encourage that talent to leave? And is there strategic value in doing so, I guess is.
Yeah, I mean, I would, kind of push back for a minute to ask what is the end goal of doing so? Are these providing opportunities for people who might probably have like a potentially better impact in the West? Or is it part of the broader push to, limit, reduce Russian power through any sort of future of technological development? Up until when does the clock run out on that plan? That's a broader question. Is this something that we kind of moderate our approach at, once the Putin regime ends? Or what is the end goal here by encouraging Russian brain drain and by encouraging the, limitations and decline, continuous, deterioration of Russian power, and what is the end date? Because if your goal is to rob society of any sort of its people who can keep it productive and innovative and vibrant, that's great, but what is the future of that society once you're kind of done with your geopolitical calculations? So and what is the hope for that society to ever transition to a style of life and a regime type that allows for more freedom and better existence with the rest of the world? So I think it's worth kind of asking, what are we trying to accomplish by pushing for, greater brain drain out of Russia?
Absolutely. Sam, do you have anything further on that?
No, I think Rita made a very valid point, and there's been a lot of kind of voices, a lot of statements made. Well, shouldn't we necessarily keep pushing for the Russian IT immigration to continue? But what we're actually seeing right now, at least from some of the both government and private sector statements from Russia, is that some of the IT workers who immigrated are starting to return back because they're facing difficulties in immigration, financial, logistical difficulties. Their families are back home. They can't necessarily do the work that they planned. And so now there's kind of a slow but steady stream of people returning to the country because they have understood that their decision may have been just made at that point in time, but long term, they are still sort of tied to Russia. And so the government is sounding sort of more confident, saying that this brain drain, which reached the point of panic in March and early April, is starting to stabilize. And therefore, they're sounding more confident on long-term plans for the Russian IT workforce because they think they can create enough conditions for them to stay and work in the country. At the same time, there are also interesting plans sort of under deliberations. One other Soviet-style plan was the distribution of graduates across the country. This existed in Soviet Union, that once people got a certain degree, they were sent by the state to a given location for at least 3 years. And that decision was never questioned. And people often stayed and lived and had families and had their life in that region where they were sent. There's an idea right now to sort of do the same with the IT graduates. Those who graduated from state enterprises, in other words, if the state invested in them, then they could be sent to a given location where there's a dearth of IT workers, where they would be most necessary for about 5 years. And then after that, they can make their own decision. And that's sort of deliberated to create a better and more equitable distribution of the IT workforce talent across the country. Because right now, and Rita can attest to that, it is concentrated in several megacities and in several regions, while the rest of the country is practically bereft of the best IT and AI workforce.
Absolutely. Is there anything you want to add to that, Rita?
No, I think Sam got it. I mean, we're at a difficult point in time where it's hard to know what's going to happen because we also are not very clear about the trajectory of the war and the trajectory of the Western response and the timeline for the sanctions and their, impact and effectiveness and survivability over time. I think a lot of people, both in Russia and outside of Russia, are in kind of a wait and see mode in terms of deciding and deciphering their future.
Absolutely. And I will say, going the next 10 minutes, I apologize, I am going to be asking for some more predictive answers as we sort of look forward. So understood that everything is still very much in flux, but I am curious. There's been a lot of dialogue in foreign policy circles about how this is more of a quote unquote traditional war than many people were expecting in the 21st century. However misled that assumption may have been. but there is some question of whether militaries will be interested in investing more in traditional conventional kinetic forces than the sort of emerging tech buzz that has been going on for the past decade or two. Do you foresee, or even now, as there's this massive deployment of conventional kinetic capabilities of the Russian military, is that going to pull from funding from military AI efforts? Is that potentially going to lead to some rethinking of where they plug in?
Well, I think when it comes to the Russian AI and robotics development, a lot of the funding for at least 2022 has been spoken for. Deputy Prime Minister Borisov just met with President Putin, and he actually indicated that Russian military will continue investing in AI and robotics capabilities going forward. Russian lessons from previous wars, and especially the recently concluded Nagorno-Karabakh war, is that the UAVs and loitering munitions are great mission multipliers, but the actual fighting and the holding of territory is actually done by conventional ground force. So there's certainly going to be investments in conventional ground forces with incremental inclusion. However, it is possible under sanctions, and whether it is possible in the first place, of new technologies like more UAVs, for example, better C4ISR systems, better command and control systems, and automated control systems, as well as others that are supposed to enable the ground and the conventional force to be more effective. We spoke earlier about the gap between the conceptual theory of future warfare and the actual practical implementation. So Russians are probably very clear-eyed about this gap. And following the conclusion of this war, in whichever way it concludes, there's going to be a lot of lessons learned about better conventional capabilities. But as Rita indicated, and it is important to note, we're not done yet. This war hasn't concluded, and we don't know exactly how it will affect Russian government and military going forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Again, with the caveat that it's impossible to know how this goes or unfolds. I think, at least from the US perspective, so much of the thinking about investment priority areas and future of war is shaped by China. And I really don't foresee any sort of significant shift away from investment in modernizing the force, investment in AI and other future technology, because this war has proved to be much more conventional and much more contingent on logistics and the intangibles of military morale and motivation. I do, however, hope that while Russians can do and will do their own lesson learned, as we are doing ours in the United States, I hope that the conclusion is not, well, the Russian military is just terrible in fighting and terrible in conducting complex military operations, so we have nothing to worry about ourselves and the future conflict that we might find ourselves entangled in. That's just something to really be cognizant of, because some of the characteristics of this war are universal. The presence of civilians on the battlefield, the increasing focus on urban operations and urban warfare, the challenges that even the best militaries face in that type of a fight, the problem with defending against a very committed, innovative, deeply motivated defender. All of these are problems that even the best militaries will struggle with. So I think the takeaways don't necessarily need to contrast whether we should be investing in conventional capabilities versus digital technologies and the cyber realm or whatnot. But it's one that has to pay a little more, I guess, respect to the fundamentals of war before we, think too much that all of the future of war fighting has completely transitioned to the digital realm.
Thank you, Rita. I think that was incredibly well said. And it's something to keep in mind as we see the rest of this conflict play out, and unfortunately any others that may come after. I do want to end this by asking the two of you what you're going to be watching for in the conflict, specifically regarding Russian AI in the next few weeks, in the next few months, even in the next few years. What are one or two things that you're really watching for that will tell you something important? What should we be watching for?
I think in terms of broad picture, I would be watching for an improvement in logistics. I think that's one of the fundamental problems that if they even attempt or try to overcome, the odds of this war lasting even longer increase. In terms of advanced technologies, if I had the access to understand what is happening in the cyber operations that are supporting the kinetic fight, I would be paying attention there, because I think they are increasingly going to be reliant on that. And even though they haven't seemed to be utilizing it earlier in the war. So those are the areas I'd be keeping attention.
Thank you. And I think actually ISC will be putting on in the near future some conversations about cyber during the war. And just quickly on the logistics, I think obviously that's a place that we're watching. I can't help but wonder if there are not some military thinkers somewhere who are thinking about how to apply artificial intelligence and data to the logistics problem. And I wonder if we'll see a reshuffling of, now that we've actually seen a large-scale war after a time of a bit of distance from the realities of conflicts, if there's some reimagining of where artificial intelligence and data can actually be most useful in waging war.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, predictive maintenance and AI for logistics has been one of the priorities for the US. It just doesn't get as much coverage because it's not as flashy as, AI for drones or, facial recognition technology. But it's definitely a priority area that deserves much more attention.
Well, yeah, it might now, especially since, thanks to Sam's colleagues, we've been schooled in the importance of truck maintenance and truck wheel maintenance. But Sam, please, what should we be looking for?
I would be looking at C4ISR and how Russia's command control, communications, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities are integrated, especially with a significant civilian element like using civilian drones and how that fits into Russia's operations. I would be watching for Russia making more sense of the battlefield data, and perhaps some of those statements about AI-enabled decision-making and data analysis and imagery analysis are going to come to fruition, at least in one form or another. We may not hear about it from the Russian media sources, but we may discern that from a more effective operation. But that's also an open question because we don't know how the war is going to conclude. Also on the civilian side, we're probably going to be watching how the sanctions continue to impact Russia's software and hardware developments, and whether or not there's going to be a spillover effect into the military and Russia's military research and development, because those are actually very interrelated in the country.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. It's always good to end on what we should be looking for. I personally find that very helpful. Thank you so much to the two of you for joining me in this conversation. It's been incredibly enlightening. I have learned a lot from the two of you, and I'm sure our audience has as well. Please follow Rita and Sam on Twitter. They have fantastic analysis. Rita is often cited in a lot of articles on this issue, as is Sam. There's a great Politico newsletter from a week ago or some days ago about the Russian AI sector that Rita is cited in, and Sam has a great piece in Defense One also about the Russia AI sector. And then I would obviously go see the work that CSET is doing on talent and AI and all of the important logistics that comes with building an AI sector. And then CNA has a fantastic Russia autonomy newsletter and a lot of studies there. So please, there's a lot of materials there if you want to know more about what we said in this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for our participants, and we hope to see you at another IST event soon. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.